The meeting room on the Vrethkai command station smelled like cold metal and old authority. It always did. The walls were black. The chairs were black. The table was a long slab of dark stone that had been taken from a planet the Vrethkai had conquered 300 years ago, and they kept it there because they liked the reminder. Supreme Executor Velharan stood at the head of that table. He was tall even by Vrethkai standards. His silicon-plated shoulders wide enough to block the light behind him. His eyes were the deep amber color of something that had never once questioned itself. He had commanded 17 planetary conquests. He had never lost a single one. He looked at the room full of officers and opened the meeting with 4 words. How long, Sol System? The war planner at the far end of the table, a compact officer named Gethral, pulled up the projection. A blue-green planet appeared in the center of the room, spinning slowly. It was a small world. Wet. Covered in one dominant species that the conclave of inhabited worlds had catalogued, assessed, ranked, and largely ignored for the past 60 years. 11 rotation, Gethrail said. Conservative estimate. We based it on their infrastructure density, population distribution, and military capacity, as registered with the Conclave Fleet Registry. And their Vorlon score? Gethrail pulled up the file. 2. Someone in the room made a sound. It was a quiet sound, low in the throat. The kind a person makes when they are told something so obvious. It almost feels like an insult to say it out loud. The Vorlon scale was the galaxy's standard tool for measuring how dangerous a civilization was. It ran from 1 to 12. A score of 1 meant the species was essentially harmless. They had fire, maybe wheels, possibly a religious conflict or two, but nothing that qualified as actual warfare. A score of 12 meant the Conclave gave that species a very wide path, and spoke to them only when absolutely necessary. A score of 2 meant a species had weapons, had used them, but had not yet figured out how to use them in any way that threatened anyone outside their own solar system. The Valesi scored a 2. The Valesi resolved political disagreements with a form of competitive flower arrangement. Velharan looked at the spinning blue-green planet. 11 rotations, he said. Not a question. A deadline being set. 11 rotations, Gethrail confirmed. The fleet will enter the Sol system at the outer edge, broadcast the standard conquest declaration, and advance on the primary population centers. We have pre-mapped 612 high-density zones. The Human Conclave Registry shows a civilian fleet of approximately 400 vessels, mostly cargo and transit. No registered warships above Class 3. Casualty projection on our side? Minimal. Statistically negligible. Velharan nodded once. That was the end of the analysis for him. He was already thinking about what came after the resource extraction schedule, the labor conversion protocols, the way the blue-green planet would look on the Vrethkai star maps once it had been properly absorbed. He almost closed the meeting there. Almost. From the left side of the table a hand went up, not a dramatic gesture, just a hand, raised like someone asking a quiet question in a room where quiet questions were not especially welcome. Sub-Commander Uriel Dawn was not the most senior officer in the room. She was not the loudest. She had a narrow face and careful eyes and a habit of going very still when she was thinking, the way certain deep-water creatures go still, right before they move. She had spent 3 full cycles embedded near human space as part of a trade observation assignment, not combat, not intelligence, just watching the way the humans moved their ships around, the way they built their stations, the way they talked to each other on open frequencies. Sub-Commander, Velharan said, not warm, just acknowledgement. I want to request a delay, Uriel Dawn said. The room did not move. But the quality of the stillness changed. 90 rotations, she continued, for deeper reconnaissance of the Sol system, specifically the outer planets and the region beyond. The outer planets are mapped, Gethrail said. Gas giants, ice, debris fields. The humans use the asteroid belt for mining operations, which are logged in the Conclave Registry. I know what the registry says. Then what is your concern? Uriel Dawn took a breath. She knew, even as she was speaking, that this was the kind of moment where what she said next would either be heard or filed away and forgotten. She had been in enough meetings to know the difference between a room that was listening and a room that was waiting for you to stop talking. This room was waiting. She said it anyway. When I was on the trade observation posting near Kepler Station, I spent time watching human communication patterns. Not military communication, civilian. The way their cargo pilots talk to each other. The way their station commanders respond to routine problems. She paused. They are calm. Very calm. The kind of calm that is not natural. The kind of calm you learn. Velharan looked at her. You want to delay a 600-ship deployment because human cargo pilots sound calm. I want to delay it because I have been near these people, and they do not behave like a species that scores a 2. Silence. Gethrael set down his tablet. The Vorlon assessment was conducted by a certified panel using standardized methodology. The humans submitted full documentation of their military capacity to the Conclave Registry. Their fleet is logged. Their weapon systems are logged. Their defensive installations are logged. I know. They scored a 2. I know what they scored. Velharan held up one hand, and the back and forth stopped. He looked at Uraeldon for a long moment. He was not angry. He was something quieter than angry, which was in some ways worse. Sub-Commander, in your time near human space, did you observe any unregistered military vessels? No. Any weapon systems not logged with the Conclave? No. Any military activity that contradicted their Vorlon assessment? She hesitated. One beat. No. Then what you are describing, Velharan said, is a feeling. The word landed in the room the way a wrong note lands in a song. Everyone heard it. No one acknowledged it. Uraeldon said nothing. We do not delay 600 ship deployments for feelings, Velharan said. He was not unkind about it. He was simply a person who had built his entire career on the idea that the numbers were correct, and the numbers said 2, and 2 was easy. File your objection through the standard channel if you wish. The fleet departs on schedule. She filed it. She went to her post. The fleet was enormous, standing at the observation port of her ship as the 600 vessels arranged themselves into formation. Uraeldon felt something she could not name, not fear exactly, not doubt exactly, but something in the neighborhood of both. She had stood near human things, watched human people, listened to human voices on open channels. There was something in the way they spoke about their ships, not the civilian ships. The civilian ships they talked about the way anyone talks about equipment, maintenance, routing, load capacity. But sometimes, on the outer edges of the frequency bands, she had caught fragments of something else, a different kind of conversation. Quieter, the kind of voice a person uses when they are talking about something they care about very much and do not want to say too loudly. She had never been able to pull a clean signal. Always fragments. Always the edge of something she couldn't quite hear. She told herself it was nothing. The fleet moved. The jump into faster-than-light travel was always the same. A pressure behind the eyes. A feeling like the universe was briefly making a decision about you, and then the stars were different, and you were somewhere else. The Vrethkai fleet came out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system, 600 ships arranging themselves in the dark between the stars and the outer boundary of the human solar system. Uraeldon looked at her sensor board. The system looked exactly like the registry said it would. The gas giants were where the charts said they were. The asteroid belt was where it was supposed to be. The inner planets sat in their orbits. The blue-green 1/3 from the star, exactly as mapped. She should have felt better. She didn't. The first thing Velharan did was order a full sensor sweep of the outer system. Standard protocol. You always check the space around you before you moved forward. The sweep came back clean. Begin approach, he said. The 600 ships began to move. Gethrael sent the standard Conclave Conquest Declaration on all human communication frequencies, a broad signal, loud enough to reach every receiver in the system. The message was the same one they always sent. It had been used 17 times before. It said, in clean, translated language, surrender your biosphere. You have been assessed. Your capacity for resistance has been evaluated. Comply with incoming directives, and your population will be preserved as a labor resource. Standard, efficient. It worked every time. 22 seconds of silence came back from the Sol system. Then a human voice. It was a woman's voice, calm and low and completely without panic. And it said, copy that. Give us a moment. Velharan looked at Gethrael. Gethrael looked at the sensor board. A moment passed. Then another. Then 5 minutes. Then 10. The fleet continued its approach at standard advance speed. Nothing changed on the sensors. The system looked exactly as it had looked before civilian vessels in their transit lanes. the mining platforms in the asteroid belt, the orbital stations around the blue-green planet, sitting quiet and still. Velharan was not concerned. He had received stranger responses than this. Some species begged. Some species went silent entirely. Some tried to negotiate even though there was nothing to negotiate. The calm voice saying, "Give us a moment," was unusual but not alarming. He gave them their moment. 11 minutes after the broadcast, Uriel Dawn's sensor board lit up. Not one contact, not 5, not 20, 214 contacts, all at once, rising from the dark side of the outer planets like they had been sitting there waiting for exactly this from behind the gas giants, from positions inside the asteroid belt that had read as mining debris, from the dead space between orbits where there was nothing, where there had always been nothing, where the sensors had confirmed there was nothing. They were not small. They were not fast. They were the heaviest things Uriel Dawn had ever seen on a sensor board, dense in a way that made the readings look wrong, like the instruments were making an error, like something was interfering with the scan. She ran the scan again. Not an error. The ships were real. They were enormous, and they were pointed directly at the Vreth-Kai fleet. "What?" said Gethrael very quietly. "Is that?" Uriel Dawn was already running identification protocols. The ships matched nothing in the Conclave fleet registry. No registration codes, no ID beacons, no logged vessel class. They had been built somewhere that was not in any record, and they had been sitting in this system for a very long time waiting to be needed. The human broadcast came back before she could finish her analysis. Same woman's voice, same calm, not gloating, not threatening, just stating a fact the way you state a fact when you have spent a long time getting ready for a specific moment, and the moment has finally arrived. "You're looking at the Terran Deep Fleet. 61 years in the making. You've come a long way. We've been waiting." Velharan said, "Nothing." Uriel Dawn looked at her sensor board. She looked at the 214 contacts. She looked at the readings that said these ships were armored in ways her instruments were not built to measure accurately, powered by reactors shielded so heavily they barely registered on thermal scans, armed with weapons that had not been fired yet but were clearly, completely ready to be. She thought about the human voice she had heard on the edge of the frequency band, years ago. The quiet voice talking about ships in the way people talk about things they care about very much. She understood now what she had been hearing. She pulled up the exit vector calculations she had started the day before the fleet departed. She had told herself she was being paranoid. She had told herself a 2 was a 2, and the math was settled. She began updating the calculations. Velharan was still looking at the sensor board. His amber eyes moved across the contacts one by one, slowly, the way a person moves when their body is still functioning normally but their mind is doing something it has never had to do before. He reached for the Vorlon file. He opened it. He looked at the number. 2. The number said 2. He looked at his sensor board, at 214 ships built by a species that had apparently been preparing for this exact Tuesday since before the Vreth-Kai had even decided to schedule the invasion. He closed the file. He did not say anything for a long moment. Uriel Dawn's exit vector calculations finished running. She saved them. She looked at the blue-green planet, still turning slowly in the center of the system, calm and small and impossibly well defended, and she thought about the woman's voice on the broadcast, the calm in it. Not the calm of ignorance, not the calm of surrender, the calm of someone who has been ready for a very long time and is no longer required to wait. She thought about something she had read once, in a human cultural archive she'd accessed during her posting an old phrase from a very old language, used in a very old human war. She had not understood it fully at the time. She understood it now. The phrase was, "Hope for the best, prepare for the worst." They had hoped for the best. They had smiled at trade partners. They had submitted their civilian fleet to the Conclave registry. They had scored a 2 on the Vorlon scale and said nothing to correct it. And for 61 years, in the dark, at the edge of their own solar system, they had prepared for the worst. They had prepared for exactly this. The Vreth-Kai fleet hung in space, 600 ships that had never lost, facing 214 ships built by a species that had spent 61 years, making sure they would not have to lose either. Velharan finally spoke. His voice was controlled, professional, the voice of a person who has built their life around certainty and has not yet admitted to themselves that the certainty has developed a problem. Battle formation, he said. All ships to combat readiness. The order went out across the fleet. On her sensor board, Uriel Dawn watched the deep fleet contacts hold their positions. They did not form up. They did not advance. They sat exactly where they were, in the dark, patient, the way something is patient, when it has already figured out every possible move you can make, and has an answer for all of them. She picked up her comms unit. She started composing a message to Velharan. She got 2 words in before she stopped. She had filed an objection. She had stood in that room and said what she knew, and been told it was just a feeling. She closed the message. She went back to her exit vector calculations. Outside the viewport, the stars were very still. The Sol system waited. The deep fleet waited. And somewhere on the bridge of a ship in the middle of that fleet, a woman with a call sign nobody had heard of yet sat in her command chair and did not look at the 600 incoming Vrethkai vessels with fear. She looked at them the way someone looks at a problem they have already solved. She had been looking at this problem for 61 years. She picked up her headset. She said 2 words to her weapons officer. Fire plan. The weapons officer said, ready. She said, execute. The waiting was over. The first 6 ships died before Velharan finished the word, return. He said return, and then his tactical display showed 6 contacts. Simply stop being contacts. No distress signal. No emergency broadcast. No slow structural failure that gave a crew time to evacuate. One moment they were there, 6 Vrethkai destroyers, each crewed by 400 officers, each armed with weapons that had leveled cities on 7 different worlds, and then they were not there. They were debris, drifting, tumbling, cooling metal in the dark between the planets. Velharan said, fire. The Vrethkai fleet opened up with everything it had, a coordinated wall of weapons fire that would have overwhelmed any military installation the Conclave had on record for a species with a score below 6. The guns were good. The targeting systems were excellent. The Vrethkai had spent 200 years perfecting the art of the first devastating salvo, the kind that breaks the enemy's will before the enemy has time to decide if they have any will left to break. The deep fleet took it, not without damage. 3 human ships took direct hits in the opening exchange, their hulls registering impacts that should have split them open. 2 of them kept moving. One slowed, drifted, fired twice more before finally going dark. The other 198 kept coming. Uriel Dawn watched her sensor board with the focused attention of someone who has stopped being surprised but has not yet stopped being scared. The human ships were wrong in ways she kept trying to catalog. Their hulls read as too dense on the sensors, not armored in the normal way, where you add layers on the outside, but dense all the way through, like something that had been built from the inside out with the specific goal of absorbing punishment and continuing to function regardless. She pulled up the technical analysis her instruments were generating in real time and read the numbers twice. The human ships had redundant everything. Redundant engines, redundant power routing, redundant weapon systems, redundant structural supports. If you destroyed one system, the next system was already running. If you destroyed that, there was a third. It was not efficient design. It was the design of a species that had thought very carefully about what happens when things go wrong, and had decided the answer was, nothing stops. Gethral, at the tactical station, was issuing corrections to the targeting solution every 30 seconds, as the human fleet's approach broke apart into something that wasn't a standard formation. They weren't moving like a fleet. They were moving like water moving around a problem, breaking into smaller groups, flowing through gaps in the Vrithkai firing lanes, finding angles that a conventional advance should not have found. They're splitting their targeting, Gethrel said. Each group is focused on a different ship class. They're ignoring our mid-range destroyers entirely. Velharan understood it a half-second later. They're taking out the flagships first. Yes. How did they know which ships were flagships? We didn't broadcast command designations. Gethrel looked at his board. He didn't answer, because the answer was one he did not want to say out loud, which was, the humans had apparently figured it out on their own, perhaps from the formation patterns, perhaps from power output signatures, perhaps from something else entirely, that the Vrethkai tactical manual had never considered worth hiding, because no enemy had ever needed to look for it before. The battle was 7 minutes old. The Times UNSS Unrelenting Times was not the largest ship in the Deep Fleet. It was not the most heavily armed. What it was central, positioned in the middle of the human formation, The way a spine is positioned inside a body. The thing everything else is connected to. Admiral Sarah Voss stood at the command console rather than sitting in the command chair, because she had a habit of standing when she was working. And this was the most intensive work of her life. She was 44 years old. She had joined the Terran Deep Fleet program at 19, when it was still classified above the level of most governments, when the people running it would look at recruits and ask a single question: "Do you believe they're coming?" She had said yes without hesitating. She had spent 25 years inside the program. She had watched the ships get built in the dark, at the edge of the solar system. She had trained the crews. She had written and rewritten again the tactical doctrine that was currently being executed across 200 ships in real time. She had a call sign times, headstone times that she had not chosen but had accepted because she understood what it meant. You put a headstone down when something is finished, when what was coming has come and been met and been ended. She was here to end it. Group 3. Angle 15 degrees starboard and hit the second formation's left flank, she said into her headset. Her voice was the same tone she used when she was going over maintenance schedules. Group 7. You've got a window on their command ship in about 40 seconds. Don't wait for confirmation. Take it. Across the fleet, her orders moved. The groups moved. The human formation shifted in ways that the Vreth Kai tactical computer was updating to track every 8 seconds, which was not fast enough, because the deep fleet was moving faster than that. She had not designed the fleet to be fast. Speed was not the point. She had designed it to be smart. 23 minutes into the engagement, Geth Ral reported that they had destroyed 11 human ships. Velharan said, "Our losses?" Geth Ral looked at the board. 41. The number landed in the command center the way a structural failure lands, not loudly, but with a deep, settling weight that changes the shape of everything around it. Velharan had lost ships before. All commanders did. But in 17 campaigns he had never reached a point where the exchange ratio was moving against him and accelerating. 41 Vreth Kai ships, 11 human ships, and the human ships that had been destroyed. He pulled up the combat logs. Most of them had been hit by concentrated fire from 3 or more Vreth Kai vessels simultaneously. The humans had built their ships to survive hits that would have ended any other vessel in the Conclave's military registry. You did not kill them with 1 shot. You did not kill them with 2. You had to pour everything you had into a single target until it finally, stubbornly, stopped. Meanwhile, his own ships were dying from single, precise, human salvos. He pushed this information to the back of his mind. He was a commander. He had resources. 600 ships was a lot of ships. He could sustain losses and still win. The math still worked in his favor, he told himself. He had to sustain more losses than he'd planned. That was all. The outcome was still the same. He told himself this. He adjusted his formation and pushed the advance. On the far edge of the battle, in a small vessel she had tucked behind the largest rock she could find in the asteroid belt, Uriel Dawn watched the sensor feed and worked on 2 things at the same time. The first thing was the exit vector calculation. She updated it every few minutes as the battle moved, keeping it current, keeping it ready. She was not sure she was going to need it. She was not sure she wasn't. The second thing was a message she had been composing for the past 20 minutes and had not sent. It was addressed to the Times Unrelenting. She had found the ship's frequency through the battle communications that the human fleet was transmitting openly, not encrypting their internal comms, which struck her as either very careless or very confident, and she had stopped believing it was careless about 30 minutes into the engagement. The humans wanted the Vreth Kai fleet to hear them talking to each other. She did not know why yet. The message she was composing was simple. She had stripped it down to the core of what she wanted to say, which was, "I am a Vreth Kai officer. I opposed this invasion. I can give you the current formation disposition and the command ship ID codes. I am not asking for anything in return." She read it back 3 times. She thought about Velharan's face when he had told her, a feeling was not a reason to delay a fleet. She sent it. The response came back in 4 minutes. She had not expected a response at all, so 4 minutes felt like immediately. The response said, "Noted. Find a rock. Hide behind it. Voss." She looked at the sensor feed. She was already behind a rock. She sent back, "Already done." No response came. Voss was busy. That was fine. Eldon opened a second file and began sending what she had promised: the formation data, the command ship codes, the communication schedule she had memorized from the pre-deployment briefings. She sent it all, and then she closed the channel and sat in the dark of her small vessel and watched the battle continue. The formation data reached the times, unrelenting times, and Voss looked at it for 45 seconds. "Well," she said to her communications officer, "that's useful." She updated 4 targeting priorities. Group 7 found the Vreth Kai secondary command ship 17 minutes later. The ship had been running without its command designation active. Vel Haran, having ordered the codes, scrambled after the first command ship was hit. It had not helped. Voss's new information had given Group 7 the power output signature to look for instead. The secondary command ship lasted 4 minutes under concentrated fire. Then it was debris too. Hour 2 of the battle. The Vreth Kai fleet had lost 67 ships. The Deep Fleet had lost 19. The exchange ratio was not improving from the Vreth Kai perspective, and Vel Haran had stopped expecting it to improve. He had moved past the phase of the battle where he was thinking about winning, and into the phase where he was thinking about managing, holding the line, finding a way to make the losses sustainable, buying time for his tactical computer to find a weakness in the human formation. The tactical computer had been trying for 90 minutes. It kept telling him the same thing. There was no weakness in the human formation, because the human formation was not a formation. It was a system. Every ship was connected to every other ship through a communication network that updated faster than his targeting systems could track. And every time he found what looked like a gap, the gap closed before he could push through it. As if the humans had already predicted he would look there. He called for a full-power weapons charge on the forward batteries and pushed his remaining ships into a concentrated central drive. A single, massive punch aimed at the heart of the human fleet. It was the move you made when subtlety had failed, when the math had failed, when you needed to break through the center and scatter the enemy into pieces you could hunt separately. His 490 remaining ships accelerated. The human fleet did not scatter. It opened. Like a hand opening, the center pulled back. The outer group swung inward, and the massive Vreth Kai central drive sailed into a corridor that had appeared from nowhere, and immediately filled on both sides with human ships, firing inward from both flanks simultaneously. Vel Haran had 6 seconds to understand what had happened. The human fleet had let him in because it was better for them if he was inside the formation than outside it. He had walked into the hand. The hand closed. The losses in the next 11 minutes were the worst of the battle. Vreth Kai ships died in groups, caught in overlapping fire from both sides, unable to pull back because the corridor behind them had sealed, unable to advance because the human ships ahead of them were positioned at distances that maximized the advantage of their heavy armor at close range. When it was over, Vel Haran had 290 ships. He had started with 600. He pulled the survivors back to the outer edge of the engagement zone and called a halt. The battle stopped. Not because the humans stopped pushing, they did stop, settling their ships back into their distributed formation with that same patient stillness they had maintained from the beginning. It was more that the battle paused to breathe, the way a storm pauses sometimes in the middle of itself. Vel Haran looked at his losses. He looked at the Vorlon file one more time. He closed it without reading it. He did not need to read the number again. The number had never been wrong before, and was entirely wrong now, and he was not yet ready to think about what that meant, because thinking about what it meant would require him to answer a question he had been avoiding since the first 6 ships had vanished off his tactical board. The question was, how long had they been ready? How long had the humans known the Vreth Kai were coming, or someone like the Vreth Kai was coming, or something was coming? How long had they been sitting in the dark at the edge of their own solar system, building and waiting and not saying anything, and scoring a 2 on a scale that measured the wrong things entirely? He pulled up the human broadcast frequency. He wanted to ask. He didn't ask. What he did instead was compose his first report to the conclave. He was required by Vreth Kai military law to file a situation report every standard day of a campaign. He had filed 16 previous campaign reports, all of them routine, all of them describing advances according to schedule. This one was harder to write. He kept it brief. He reported losses. He reported the presence of an unregistered human military fleet. He reported that the 11 rotation schedule was no longer achievable. He did not say that he did not know when the schedule would become achievable again, because he was not ready to file that report. He sent it. He sat in his command chair, in the black-walled room that smelled like cold metal, and he looked at the blue-green planet on his navigation display, still turning, still calm, still impossibly defended, in her rock in the asteroid belt. Uriel Dawn received a second message on the frequency she had opened with the Times, unrelenting. It contained no words, just a set of coordinates. Inside the asteroid belt, a different position, more protected, deeper in the field where the dense rocks would scatter sensor readings. Move there, the coordinates said, without saying anything at all. She looked at the coordinates. She looked at her sensor feed. She moved there. She sat in the new position, in the dark, surrounded by ancient rocks that were billions of years old and had watched a great many things happen in this solar system without particular concern for any of them. She thought about what she had seen in the past 2 hours. She thought about the human fleet, 200 ships built in secret, tucked away in the dark at the edge of this system, waiting, not panicking, not broadcasting warnings, not begging the conclave for help, just waiting, with 61 years of patience and work and preparation sitting behind them, for the thing they had always known was coming. She thought about the calm voice on the broadcast. Give us a moment. The moment had been 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, 200 ships had risen out of the dark. She thought about what kind of species builds 200 warships in secret, and then waits, and keeps on waiting, while the galaxy looks the other way. What kind of species does that? What do they think about? In all those years of waiting? Do they hope they are wrong? Do they hope the ships will never be needed? She did not know. What she knew was that the ships had been needed, and they had been ready. Day 3 of the battle, and Velharan had stopped thinking about the schedule. The schedule said 11 rotations. They were on day 3. He had 260 ships left. The math was not a kind thing to look at, so he stopped looking directly at it and focused instead on what could still be done, which was the only useful thing a commander could do when the situation had stopped looking like the situation they had planned for. He had changed his strategy twice. Neither change had worked. The first change had been a flanking approach, splitting his remaining fleet into 3 groups and hitting the human formation from multiple angles simultaneously. The human fleet had responded by collapsing inward into a tighter arrangement that was, somehow, harder to damage than the spread-out formation had been. The concentrated fire from the tighter human group had destroyed 31 more Vrethkai vessels in 40 minutes. The second change had been a long-range weapons approach, pulling his ships back to maximum effective weapons range and trying to wear the human fleet down from a distance. The humans had responded by not moving at all, sitting where they were and returning fire with weapons that, Gethrael informed him, with a voice that had stopped sounding fully composed, had a longer effective range than anything in the current Vrethkai arsenal. So they had pulled back further. The humans had followed, slowly, patiently, like they had nowhere else to be. On the bridge of the Times, unrelenting, Admiral Voss was reviewing a maintenance report when one of her junior officers brought her the tactical summary for Day 3. She read it without setting down the maintenance report, 2 documents at once, because the battle and the maintenance were both hers to manage, and she did not separate them in her mind the way some commanders would have. The battle was going well. She would not say this to anyone, because saying a battle was going well when people were dying in it was a particular kind of bad manners she had no patience for. 9 more human ships had been destroyed in Day 3. Every one of those ships had been crewed. She kept a mental count of the crews, not the ships. Ships were metal. Crews were something else. But the battle was going well. Status on the reserve groups? She said to her comms officer. Groups 15 through 22 are holding position at the outer belt. Groups 23 and 24 are staged behind Uranus. Reserve Alpha is still in the Oort. Voss nodded. Keep them there. We don't need them yet. The junior officer who had brought the tactical summary was still standing nearby. He was 22 years old and had trained for this for 3 years, and this was his first actual combat engagement, and he had not slept properly in 3 days, which was visible in the way his eyes sat in his face. He said, "Do you think we'll need them at all?" Voss looked at him. "Yes," she said, "eventually. But we're winning." "We're winning now," she said. "That's different from having won." She picked up the maintenance report again. "Get some food. You're not useful to me running on nothing." He went. She looked at the tactical display. 260 Vrethkai ships. Still a significant force. still capable of real damage. She had lost 28 ships in 3 days, which was within the parameters she had projected, but she had projected correctly because she had spent years trying to model what a species the size of the Vrethkai would bring to an invasion of Sol, and then building everything around the answer. The answer had been, a lot. Bring more. She had brought more. What the Vrethkai had not accounted for, what the Vorlon scale did not measure, was that human military design philosophy had developed, over 4,000 years of fighting each other, in a very particular direction. Other species built weapons first and armor second. You built the thing that hit the enemy, and then you added protection as an afterthought. Humans had learned, through a long and terrible education in the specific ways other humans could destroy things, to build the armor first. The deep fleet ships were not elegant, they were not beautiful, they were massive, dense, overbuilt objects that took 3 times as long to construct as a conventional warship of equivalent size. Because every system inside them had been designed to keep working when everything around it was failing. The reactor shielding alone was heavier than the entire hull of most Conclave warships. The weapons were not the most sophisticated in the galaxy, but they were accurate, they were powerful, and they were backed by enough redundant power routing that you could lose 60% of the ship's internal systems and still fire them. The Vrethkai had faster ships, better communications, more sophisticated targeting. They had all the advantages the Vorlon scale actually measured. They just kept hitting things that wouldn't break. On day 4, Velharan tried something new. He had been reviewing the human tactical communication intercepts, the ones the humans were apparently transmitting without encryption, and something had struck him as wrong about them. Not the content, which was professional and precise and gave away nothing useful. The wrongness was in the pattern. The human commander was too calm in her communications. Not performed calm. Real calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing what is going to happen next. She knew what he was going to do before he did it. He sat with that thought for an hour. Then he pulled his communications officer and asked a question he had never needed to ask before in 17 campaigns. Is there any possibility our internal communications are being monitored? The communications officer ran a check. The check took 20 minutes. The result was no, their internal comms were encrypted to Conclave military standard. Same as always. There was no penetration, no tap, no leak. Velharan sat with that too. Then, slowly, he began to think about what else it could be. If the human commander was not reading his communications, how was she responding to his tactical decisions before he made them? She could not be predicting him individually. She didn't know him. She didn't know his tactical preferences or his training, or the 17 previous campaigns that had built the instincts he was now operating on. But she knew the Vrethkai. She had studied them. She had, presumably, spent a very long time studying them. How the Vrethkai fought. What they did when they had the advantage. What they did when they didn't. What moves they made when they were losing ground and needed to change something. She had built an entire fleet doctrine around the assumption that the Vrethkai would fight exactly the way the Vrethkai had always fought. He was not fighting her. He was fighting a version of himself she had constructed in advance. This was, he realized, the most uncomfortable thing he had ever understood about another species. He changed his approach again on day 4. Not a tactical change, a harder change. He started making decisions he would not normally have made, choices that contradicted his own training, his own instincts, things that didn't make conventional military sense. He was trying to stop being predictable. He was trying to be a version of himself she hadn't studied. It helped a little. The human fleet had to adjust several times on day 4, and 2 of its adjustment moves opened, small windows that his ships managed to hit. They destroyed 7 human vessels that day instead of the previous daily average of 4. He lost 33. In her rock in the asteroid belt, Uriel Doan had been watching the battle data for 4 days. She had eaten twice, slept in her chair, and was beginning to feel the particular kind of tired that lives behind the eyes and makes everything slightly blurry around the edges. She had sent a total of 6 data packets to the Times, unrelenting times over the course of the battle formation, updates, as Velharan rearranged his forces, power signature changes she noticed on the sensor feed, the shift in communications frequency timing that she'd caught on day 2. She had not asked for anything, she had not re-established contact. She had simply sent the data when she had it, and gone back to watching. On day 5, she received a single message from the Times, unrelenting. It said, Good eyes. Voss. She looked at it for a while. She composed a response 3 times and deleted all 3. Finally, she sent one sentence. What happens when it is over? The response took 40 minutes, which meant Voss had been busy when the message came in and had only gotten to it when she had a moment. For you? Undecided. For them? They go home. V. Uriel Don, read it. Read it again. They go home. Not. They are destroyed. Not. They are captured. Not. They are processed as war criminals. They go home. She put her communicator down and went back to watching the sensor feed. Day 5 was when the reserves appeared. Velharan had pushed his remaining forces into a new configuration, wider, more spread out, designed to cover more of the human fleet's flanks and prevent the closing hand maneuver that had cost him so much on Day 2. It was a reasonable response to Day 2. Gethrael had suggested it. The tactical computer had agreed it was the correct adjustment. 17 minutes into the new configuration, the sensor board added contacts. Not 214 this time. 81. They came from inside the asteroid belt, from behind the gas giants, from positions that the new formation had accidentally exposed when it spread out, positions that could not be reached by the wider formation without completely reorganizing, which would take time, during which the new ships would be free to move. Velharan looked at his board. He counted the new contacts. Then he looked at the remaining human fleet, which had not used this moment to advance. It was waiting, holding its position, as if it didn't need to advance because the new arrivals were already moving into positions that would complete the tactical picture without any help from the main fleet. The new ships moved into a pattern he recognized after a moment. They were closing off his exit vectors, not blocking them entirely. There were gaps, but the gaps led to specific corridors, and at the end of those corridors, the main fleet was waiting. They were not attacking him. They were hurting him. Executor, Gethrael said. His voice had fully lost its professional tone now. He was saying the word the way a person says it when they don't know what comes next. The new contacts are blocking our primary retreat path. I can see that. What are your orders? Velharan looked at his 219 remaining ships. He looked at 291 human ships on his board, the original fleet, plus the new arrivals. He did the math. He gave the order to push forward on the central axis. Hard. Everything they had, trying to punch through before the new arrivals finished closing the flanks. It was the right move. It was possibly the only move. You didn't wait to be surrounded. You hit before the trap closed. The human main fleet came forward to meet him. They did not panic. They did not scatter. They came forward like a wall, the way Velharan had come forward 17 times, in 17 campaigns, on 17 different worlds, certain of the outcome, and he had the strange and deeply unpleasant experience of understanding, for the first time in his life, what it must have felt like to be on the other side of that wall. The battle on Day 5 lasted 9 hours. When it was over, Velharan had 112 ships. He had started with 600. He called for a full stop. He called his remaining commanders on a private channel and told them to hold position and maintain defensive formation and wait for his orders. His voice was steady. He had maintained a steady voice for 5 days, and he was going to maintain it now because it was the only thing he still had complete control over. He sat in his chair. He looked at the blue-green planet. Then he picked up the general communications channel and made a broadcast to the Deep Fleet. This is Executor Velharan of the Vrethkai 7th Conquest Fleet. I am requesting a halt to combat operations for the purpose of transmitting a formal communication to the commanding officer of your fleet. Silence. Then Voss's voice came back. Calm. Not gloating. Just there. This is Admiral Voss. Go ahead, Executor. He had planned to say something composed. Something that a commander says when they are discussing terms. Something that did not admit to everything the past 5 days had made undeniable. What he said instead was, "How long were you building them?" Pause. The first ship laid keel in 2181. Voss said, "We commissioned the last one 9 months ago." He calculated the years. 61 years. About that. Before you had reliable faster-than-light transit. Yes. You started building warships before you could reach the stars. We knew something was out there, Voss said. We figured it was better to be ready. Velharan sat with that. He had conquered 17 worlds. He had looked at the Vorlon scale scores for all of them, and the numbers had always been right. The numbers had told him what he was walking into. The numbers had never been wrong. The number had said 2. The Vorlon scale, he said, did not account for you. No, Voss said. It didn't. He sent his first honest report to the conclave that night. Not the managed version. Not the version that framed the losses as temporary. The honest one. He described the deep fleet. He described the tactics. He described what the Vorlon scale had missed, and how it had missed it, and what the cost of that missing had been. He ended it with one sentence. The Vorlon scale does not account for these people. He sent it. He looked at the stars. Somewhere in the asteroid belt, in her rock, Uriel Dawn was looking at the same stars. She pulled up the message from Voss again. They go home. She was not sure yet which home she meant when she thought about that word. She had a home on the Vrethkai station, where she had been posted. She had a room there, a small one. It had a window. She looked at the Sol system outside her ship's viewport. It was a quiet system, clean. The blue-green planet turned. The star burned. The asteroid belt drifted. She thought about the fact that this species had looked at the galaxy around them 61 years ago and decided, without knowing who was coming or when or in what number, that when they came, they would not find humanity unprepared, not defiant, not aggressive, not warmongering, just ready. There was a difference, she thought. A significant one. She was still working out what the difference was. Outside, the battle was paused, and the stars were very still. The battle ended on day 7, not with a final explosion, not with a dramatic last stand. It ended with Velharan's 112 ships requesting safe passage out of the Sol system, and Voss granting it on 3 conditions. All weapon systems powered down, all propulsion held to minimum transit speed, and a single Terran observer vessel would accompany the Vrethkai fleet to the edge of the system. Velharan accepted all 3, without negotiating. The human observer ship was small and fast, and it stayed behind the Vrethkai formation the whole way out, quiet as a shadow, running no communications, just watching, making sure. When the last Vrethkai vessel crossed the edge of the Sol system, the observer ship stopped, held position, watched the Vrethkai fleet make their jump to FTL and vanish. Then it turned around and went home. Voss received the confirmation from the observer ship's captain. They're out. System is clear. And stood for a moment without responding. Her comms officer waited. Her tactical officer waited. The whole bridge waited, with the specific quality of waiting that happens when everyone knows something significant has just finished, and nobody is quite sure how to be now that it's done. Voss said, "Battle log closed. All hands, stand down from combat readiness. Group commanders, begin recovery operations." She took off her headset and set it on the console. She walked to the back of the bridge where the observation bay was a small room, barely big enough for 6 people, with a wide, curved viewport that looked out at the stars. She went in. She closed the door. She stood at the viewport and looked at the Sol system, the asteroid belt, the gas giants, the inner planets, and beyond them, the blue-green one. She was holding a photograph. Paper. Old. The image was of a woman in her 50s, standing in front of a construction frame that was too massive to fit fully in the picture, just a section of it, a curve of hull plating the size of a city block, still raw and unfinished, lit by temporary work lights. The woman in the photograph was squinting against the lights and smiling. The woman was Voss's mother. Her mother had spent 30 years working on the Deep Fleet construction program in the Oort Cloud. She had been on the team that designed the hull density specifications that had made the Vrethkai weapons so frustratingly ineffective. She had retired 6 years ago. She was still alive, living in a city near the coast in a country that would have been destroyed in 11 rotations if the fleet had not held. Voss looked at the photograph. She looked at the stars. She did not cry. She was not going to cry. Not because crying was wrong or weak, but because she had set that aside a long time ago, and it would come back to her later, in its own time. And she knew that from experience. Grief found its moment. You did not have to find it first. What she felt now was something that did not have a clean name. Not triumph. Triumph was too light for what had been spent to get here. Not relief, because relief implied she had been afraid, and she had not been afraid exactly, she had been ready, which was different. What she felt was closer to the way the ground feels after a long storm. Quiet, still, permanently changed in small ways you would not be able to measure, until later. She stood there for 11 minutes. Then she put the photograph in her jacket pocket and went back to the bridge. There was a lot of work to do. The recovery operations took 6 days. 28 deep fleet ships had been destroyed in the battle, some of them going dark quickly, and some taking time. The crew recovery numbers from the debris fields were difficult. The deep fleet rescue teams worked around the clock, methodical and professional, and at the end of 6 days the numbers were what they were, and could not be made better by working longer. Voss read the final count herself. She did not ask anyone to summarize it. Then she sat down and wrote 28 individual messages. Not the standard casualty notification format that military systems generated automatically. Her own words. It took her 3 days. She sent them through the official Terran Defense Council channels with a personal flag that indicated they were from the fleet commander directly. She did this in the time between managing the recovery operations and the political situation. The political situation was considerable. The conclave of inhabited worlds had been receiving signals for 7 days. The first signals had been politely confused official inquiries about the unregistered military vessels appearing on sensors near Sol. By day 3, when the battle data started filtering through conclave monitoring stations, the signals had become less polite and more panicked. By day 7, the conclave's emergency channel was running hot with diplomatic transmissions from species who had very recently been completely uninterested in humanity and had undergone a rapid and thorough change of perspective. Voss handed all of those to the Terran Defense Council, which handed them to the UN, which convened an emergency session that lasted 40 hours and produced a document that mostly said, "We will respond in due time," in a manner consistent with Terran interests. The diplomatic office of the conclave sent a follow-up signal, requesting clarification on what due time times meant. The UN response to that was a masterpiece of pleasant language arranged to mean absolutely nothing, which was something humans had been refining for several thousand years of diplomatic practice. Uriel Dawn emerged from her rock on day 7, when Voss sent her coordinates to an escort vessel that brought her to the Times Unrelenting. The escort vessel was crewed by a woman named Chen who did not ask any questions, which Uriel Dawn was grateful for, because she did not have good answers to the most obvious ones. The Times Unrelenting Times was larger from the inside than she had expected. Clean, functional, without decoration, every surface was working surface. Every space was justified. She had been in Vrithkai warships all her life, and they had a particular aesthetic of controlled intimidation. The black walls, the dark stone, the heavy presence of authority built into every design choice. The Times Unrelenting Times did not look intimidating. It looked busy, like a place where people worked. The ensign who met her at the docking bay was young, the same young ensign she had seen referenced in the communications logs. She realized he had a friendly face and looked like he had recently stopped being exhausted and was now in the phase where he did not quite know how to exist without exhaustion. "Subcommander Uriel Dawn," he said. "Yes, I'm Ensign Dara Reyes. I'll take you to Admiral Voss." He paused. "Are you hungry? I can get something from the galley. We have honestly a lot of options. We over-provisioned for a long campaign." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Food would be acceptable." He smiled. It was a genuinely warm expression, completely without performance. She had spent 5 years studying humans and she could tell performed warmth from real warmth, and this was real. She did not entirely know what to do with that. He brought her to a small room near the command section. Food on a tray, she could not identify most of it, but ate what she could and went to tell Voss she was there. He came back 20 minutes later. "The Admiral will see you now." The meeting with Voss was short. The Admiral was smaller than Uriel Dawn had constructed in her head from the voice on the communications channel. Medium height, lean, with short gray-streaked hair, and the face of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions and had found a way to live with most of them. She was standing when Uriel Dawn entered, which meant she was still in work mode, which meant this was a functional meeting rather than a social one. Voss looked at her for a moment. "You sent me 6 data packets," she said. "They were all useful. The formation change on day 4 saved 2 of my ships." Uriel Dawn said, "I filed a formal objection to the invasion before the fleet departed. It was denied." "I know. We intercepted your objection." Uriel Dawn had not known they could do that. Voss said, "You want to know what happens to you?" "Yes. The Conclave will process the Vrethkai personnel through standard post-conflict protocols. Repatriation. You're entitled to go with them." Voss paused. "You can also apply for observer status here." I'll support the application, if you choose to make it. Why? Because you did the math when it mattered, Voss said. People who do the math when it matters are useful. Uriel Dawn sat with that. I will think about it, she said. Take your time. Voss picked up a tablet from her desk. She was already moving on to the next thing. As Uriel Dawn was beginning to understand, she always was. Reyes will show you to quarters. We'll sort out the formal arrangements when the Vrethkai transport arrives. That was the end of the meeting. Walking back through the corridors of the Times, unrelenting Times with Ensign Reyes, Uriel Dawn watched the crew. They were tired. They were visibly, deeply tired in the way that 5 days of combat exhaustion sits in a body. The shoulders carry it, the eyes carry it, the particular quality of silence in a hallway carries it, but they were functional, moving with purpose, nodding to each other when they passed. Someone in one corridor was laughing quietly at something on a small screen. The sound quickly muffled when they noticed her. She noticed that nobody looked at her with hostility. Curiosity, yes. Wariness, some. But not hostility. She found this difficult to process. They had just spent 7 days fighting her species. They had lost 28 ships, and the people in them, and the crew of the ship that had won, walked past the officer from the enemy fleet without hostility. She stopped walking. Reyes stopped too, looking at her. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure, he said. Why do they not? She searched for the right word. Why do they not hate me? Reyes thought about it. Not performing thought, actually thinking. We've got a saying, he said. Sort of old. Hate the war, not the soldier. It's not universal. Some people feel differently, but it's the general direction most of us try to go. She processed this. You had 61 years to become angry, she said. To watch for something coming and build hate alongside the ships. Dupli. Yeah, Reyes said. Some people did. And the rest? He shrugged. A small, entirely human gesture. Built the ships instead of the hate. Figured if it came to this, we'd need the ships more. She looked at him. He looked at her. Can we keep walking? He said. I haven't eaten since this morning, and there's only so long I can be inspiring on an empty stomach. She discovered, to her own considerable surprise, that she almost smiled. The Vrethkai transport arrived 3 days later. Standard conclave civilian vessel, unarmed, sent to collect the surviving fleet personnel and the remains of Velharan's command group. The survivors were processed through the Times, unrelenting's Times, docking bay in groups, quiet, subdued, avoiding the eyes of the human crew who processed their boarding in a professional and entirely non-humiliating way. Velharan came last. He was brought to a small meeting room for the formal end-of-conflict documentation that conclave protocol required. Voss was already there, seated this time, the paperwork laid out in front of her. They signed the documents. Conclave standard form, cessation of hostilities, withdrawal confirmation, damage acknowledgement. When it was done, the room held a silence that neither of them filled immediately. Then Velharan said, I want to know what the Vorlon scale missed. Voss looked at him. Everything that can't be measured by looking at what you've built, she said. It measured our registered fleet, our logged weapons, our public infrastructure. She paused. It didn't measure the 61 years of people deciding to be ready, rather than hoping they wouldn't need to be. Velharan was quiet for a moment. You were afraid, he said, not accusing, almost wondering. You built all of this because you were afraid. We built all of this, Voss said, because we were practical. She stood, extended her hand in the human formal gesture. He had been briefed on it. He took it. What was said in the next moment, between the two of them, was not recorded by anyone. The room had no log running. Uriel Dawn, who had been standing outside in the corridor, heard nothing through the door. What she saw when Velharan came out was different enough from what he had looked like going in that she almost did not recognize him. Not destroyed, not defeated in the simple sense of losing a battle. Something had gone out of him. The part that had never questioned anything. He stopped when he saw her. He said 3 words in Vrethkai. Then he walked to the transport, and she did not see him again. When Reyes asked her later, because Reyes always asked, it was apparently a fundamental quality of his personality, what Velharan had said. She was quiet for a moment. In your language, she said, the closest meaning is, again, never. She had made her decision by then. She had submitted the observer status application 2 days before. Voss had signed the recommendation. She was staying. She stood at the viewport of her quarter's small room, a window, not so different from home, and watched the transport take the Vrithkai personnel away. She watched until the ship was too small to see and then continued watching the space where it had been. The Sol system was quiet. The blue-green planet turned in the distance, catching the light of its star, looking exactly like the pictures she had seen of it in the archives. Unremarkable, small, impossibly alive. She had come to this system as part of a fleet that intended to own it inside 11 rotations. She was now a resident. She had not made this decision sentimentally. She was not a sentimental creature. She had made it because of the math, because of everything she had watched in 7 days of battle, because of the calm voice on the broadcast, the 61 years of preparation, the ships rising from the dark, the ensign who could not be inspiring on an empty stomach, and 3 words from a broken executor who had never in his life been required to be afraid. She stayed because of the math. The math said this was where things were going to happen next, whatever times next times turned out to be. The conclave of inhabited worlds had existed for 412 years. In that time it had managed trade disputes, border conflicts, 3 cases of species-level extinction events, and 1 full-scale war between the Heth Confederacy and the Osol Republic that had lasted 20 years and reshaped the western arm of the galaxy. It had processed the membership applications of 67 species. It had adjudicated 614 formal complaints. It had held thousands of emergency sessions. It had never held an emergency session quite like this one. The session lasted 40 hours. The representatives of 31 species sat in the great chamber of the conclave station, a vast circular room designed to make everyone feel equally small, which usually worked and looked at the battle data from the Sol system on their displays and said nothing useful for a very long time. The Heth ambassador said, they had no registered military fleet above Class 3. No one responded to this because it did not require a response. Everyone knew what the registry said. The registry was the problem, the Malri representative said. They submitted complete documentation to the conclave. We have their signatures. They declared all registered vessels. There is no violation of conclave transparency protocols. The Heth ambassador said. The ships were not registered. The Malri representative said. There is no requirement to register ships that have not left your home system. Silence. This was technically correct. The conclave transparency protocols required member species to register military vessels that operated in shared interstellar space. The Deep Fleet had never left the Sol system. It had been built in the Sol system, had operated within the Sol system, and had engaged an invading force within the Sol system. Every ship was, by strict legal definition, a domestic vessel. 3 more species representatives looked at their legal advisors. The legal advisors all had the same expression. The Uzal representative, who was old enough to have been alive during the war with the Heth, and therefore had a specific relationship with the concept of military surprise, said very quietly, the question we should be asking is not whether they violated protocol. The question is how long we were wrong about them, and what else we are wrong about. That landed differently. The chamber went a different kind of quiet. The Vorlon Commission was the conclave's response to its own embarrassment. Assembled within 10 days of the battle's end, it was the most qualified panel that had ever been put together for the purpose of reassessing a species' military classification. It included 3 leading xenosociologists, 2 former military commanders, a conclave data analyst who had designed the original Vorlon scale methodology, and an independent observer from a neutral species that had never interacted with humanity. They reviewed everything, the battle data, the 61 years of construction records that the Terran Defense Council released voluntarily in a gesture of transparency that the Commission found simultaneously reassuring and somehow more alarming than secrecy would have been, the tactical doctrine documents, the reserve fleet deployment logs, the weapons specifications, the hull density engineering records that showed, in precise and readable technical language, exactly how and why the Deep Fleet ships had been built to absorb the kind of fire the Vrethkai fleet was capable of producing. They studied it all. They ran the Vorlon scale calculations. The lead assessor, a Malri named vessel theorist Orath, had been doing this work for 40 years. She had recalibrated 4 species Vorlon scores during her career, always upward when species surprised her, never by more than 3 points. She had a reputation for precision. She looked at her calculations. She ran them again. Then she wrote the Commission's private memo to the Conclave Council. It was 3 sentences. We recommend not publishing a revised score. A number invites comparison, and this species should not be compared to anything currently in the Conclave Registry. We recommend instead a new classification category, which we have tentatively labeled prepared. She attached a footnote explaining what times prepared times meant. It meant a species that had spent more time anticipating the worst than hoping for the best, and had built accordingly, and had been correct in their anticipation, and were now sitting in their home system surrounded by ships that had not all been shown to anyone yet. That last part was in the footnote. The Conclave Council read the memo. Then they read the footnote. Then several of them requested clarification on the phrase, times not all been shown. The Terran Defense Council's official response to this clarification request was, the Terran Deep Fleet maintains operational security protocols as standard practice. This was also technically true, and also completely uninformative. The diplomatic signals from the Conclave had been arriving at Terran communications channels in a steady stream since day 3 of the battle, but they had accelerated significantly after the battle data had been fully distributed. Species that had filed humanity under times minor, low priority, Vorland 2 times in their diplomatic databases, were rapidly and extensively refiling. The Terran UN Diplomatic Office handled all incoming signals with the same pleasant, non-committal language it had been refining for centuries. Yes, we are open to improved relations. Yes, we welcome dialogue. We will schedule formal sessions at a time consistent with our current post-conflict priorities. Thank you for your interest in humanity. Thank you for your interest in humanity. The person who had written that line had no idea it would become the most quoted phrase from the entire post-battle diplomatic period. It was used in academic papers. It was discussed in political theory courses on 6 different conclave worlds. The Maori translated it into their primary language, and the translation retained every layer of its meaning, which was, we see what you are doing, and we find it a little funny. The Vrethkai handled their post-battle situation with less humor. Velharan returned to the Vrethkai capital and filed his full report, and stood in front of the War Council and answered their questions for 11 hours. He answered everything they asked directly, which was unusual enough that it made the Council uncomfortable. They were used to commanders managing failure carefully, framing it, finding the angles that minimized their personal responsibility. Velharan did not do any of that. He said, we went in with wrong information. We fought as well as we could fight. We lost. He said, the humans were ready in ways we did not know how to look for, and will need to account for going forward. He said, the Vorland scale is not sufficient for classification purposes, and should be substantially revised. He said, again, never. The War Council voted to withdraw all Vrethkai expansion plans in the Sol System's direction permanently. This was not altruism. It was the conclusion of a straightforward calculation that even the most aggressive members of the Council could follow. The cost of a second attempt, against a force that was now fully alert and had demonstrated what it was capable of, was not survivable. The galaxy adjusted, not loudly, not with ceremony. The adjustment happened the way most large adjustments happen, through thousands of small decisions made by individuals and institutions rethinking things they had previously taken for granted. Trade routes were quietly altered to pass closer to Sol rather than avoiding it. Diplomatic channels that had been at minimum engagement were upgraded to priority status. Academic institutions began filing requests for cultural and scientific exchange with Terran universities, many of them from species that had never previously expressed interest in what humans were thinking about. On Earth, the reaction to winning was more complicated than the outside galaxy might have expected. There was celebration. Of course there was. The cities were alive for days after the battle ended. The relief enormous, the pride real. For a week, every public screen on Earth showed the same images: the Deep Fleet rising from the dark, the Vrethkai fleet in retreat, the observer ship watching them go. People cried in the streets. People laughed in the streets, both at the same time. And then the names started being read. The names of the crews of the 28 ships that had been destroyed. Each name read in full, by a different person, in a different city. Broadcast across all public channels, simultaneously. It took 4 days to read all of them. The planet that had been celebrating went quiet in a particular way during those 4 days. Not grief that replaced the relief. Both, at the same time. The way it always is when a thing has been won and you count what was paid. Voss was in Canberra for the official ceremony, when the battle was formally closed on the Terran defense record. She stood on a stage in a large public space and received the honors and said the right things and looked composed. Because she was composed, in the way that had nothing to do with not feeling things, and everything to do with having already decided how she was going to carry them. After the ceremony, she walked back to her transport, and a journalist caught up to her and asked the question that had been in every news cycle for a month. Admiral, what do you say to the species in the conclave who are now seeking friendships with Earth? The same species who looked the other way when the Vreth Kai fleet departed. Voss stopped walking. She looked at the journalist. She said, I say welcome. I say we look forward to productive relations. I say the people who built and crewed the Deep Fleet did it so we would have the option of choosing our future rather than having it chosen for us. We've done that. Now, we get to decide what we build next. Number 3. And the Deep Fleet itself? The journalist said. There are calls in some member states for decommissioning, for a show of good faith to the conclave. Voss smiled. The Deep Fleet is not a threat to anyone, she said. It is a guarantee. There is a difference. She got in her transport. The journalist stood on the steps and typed their notes. 2 months later, Uriel Dawn was interviewed by a graduate student in Seoul, who was writing a thesis on the post-battle conclave realignment. The student was young and earnest, and had prepared 40 questions, most of which Uriel Dawn answered briefly and precisely. She was developing a reputation on Earth as someone who gave clear answers to unclear questions, which she understood was considered a virtue here. 40 questions in, the student asked one she had not prepared. What surprised you most about humanity? Uriel Dawn sat with it. The student waited. She had learned, interviewing this particular subject, that you waited. Uriel Dawn said, every spacefaring species I know of, every one built weapons when they felt strong. When they had resources, stability, confidence, strength made weapons. She paused. Your species built weapons when you felt vulnerable. When you did not know what was out there. When you had no confirmation that anything was coming. Another pause. You were afraid, and instead of hiding that fear, you made it into something useful, something structural. You built the fear into the hull and launched it into space. The student was typing fast. Is there a word for that in your language? The student asked. Uriel Dawn thought about it for a long time. No, she said. I do not think we had the concept. The interview was published the following week, and the one-line times you built the fear into the hull and launched it into space times went further than anything else in the piece, translated into 47 conclave languages, discussed in diplomatic briefings and academic papers and, eventually, carved into the dedication wall of the Terran Deep Fleet Memorial that was built 2 years later in the asteroid belt, near the position where the first Vreth Kai ship had been destroyed. Not a triumphant monument, a quiet one, names on stone, a dedication. And that line, the Deep Fleet did not stand down. This was not an aggressive act. It was not announced as a policy. It simply continued to be what it had always been, ships in the dark, in their positions, quiet and ready, registered now with the conclave registry because there was no longer any reason not to, but positioned exactly as they had been during the 61 years before anyone knew they existed. The conclave's new diplomatic representative to Earth was a Malri named Essen Rule, who arrived at the Terran orbital station with a 12-person delegation and a careful briefing package that contained, among other things, a note from vessel theorist Orath advising him that the humans were polite, patient, and not to be underestimated in any interaction, formal or informal. Essen Rule was thorough. He read the briefing package 3 times. He arrived prepared. He was met at the docking bay by a Terran diplomatic aide who showed him to his quarters. The quarters were comfortable. The station was clean and well-maintained. The human staff were professional and friendly. He looked out the viewport of his quarters at the space around the station. He could see the asteroid belt in the distance. He could not see any ships. He asked the diplomatic aide, making conversation, trying to establish rapport why the Deep Fleet vessels were not stationed in visible orbit. Would that not be reassuring? A display of presence? Most species maintained visible military forces in their home system stations. The aide smiled. It was a pleasant smile. "They're more reassuring where they are," the aide said. Essenrule looked at the viewport, at the asteroid belt in the distance, at the dark space between the planets where nothing was visible and something was, without any doubt, there. He turned back to the aide. "Of course," he said. He did not ask about it again. Uriel Dawn moved into a small apartment in Seoul 3 months after the battle. She had a room with a window. The window looked out at the street below, which was always moving people and machines, and the complex daily business of a species that never seemed to stop doing things. She watched it for long periods, the way you watch something when you are still learning what it means. She had been given a position at the Conclave Liaison Office, translating and advising on Vrethkai diplomatic communications. She was good at it. She was good at most things she decided to be good at. In her second month in Seoul, she received a communication from the Vrethkai diplomatic office, a formal one, signed by the new War Council chair, who had replaced the previous one after the post-battle accounting was finished. The communication informed her that her military commission had been formally retired, as she had ceased active service. It included her full service record. It included the filed objection from before the fleet's departure now, she noticed, marked in the record as time substantiated. She read that word several times. Substantiated. She folded the communication and put it in a drawer. She went to the window. The street was busy, same as always. Someone below was arguing over the price of something at a market stall. A child was running ahead of her parents' reach with the specific determination of someone who has decided this particular direction is the correct one. 2 people were sitting on steps eating food from containers and talking loudly about something she could not hear. It was, she had been slowly learning, a loud species, full of arguments and children running and people sitting on steps, full of contradictions she had not finished cataloging, capable of 61 years of quiet patience, and also of being completely unable to resolve a market stall dispute without both parties raising their voices. They had built 200 ships in the dark and waited with perfect discipline, and then come home to argue about prices and run ahead of their parents and eat lunch on the steps. She was still working out what the difference was. She was fairly certain she had several years of working it out still ahead of her. This was, she had decided, acceptable. The street was busy. The stars, beyond the atmosphere, were where they always were, and in the dark between the planets, patient and quiet and ready for the next Tuesday that might come however many years off. From whatever direction the deep fleet held its positions and waited, as it had always been built to do, as it would continue to do, for as long as it was needed, which, if you asked Admiral Voss, was the same as always.